All right. So good morning, everybody, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're coming from. And welcome to today's webinar. For those that don't know me, my name is Esther Ndeti, and I work with the East Africa Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. The EAVCA, which is what our organization is in short, we launched a webinar series exploring what it takes to continue performing through these uncertain times with the coronavirus rapidly spreading across the world. So this is our third session or webinar, and we're delighted to be joined by Roger Hitchcock, who's a senior partner with the SIRDAR Group. The SIRDAR Group has hosted a series of webinars and workshops really looking at how to support businesses through this period. And so I would like to hand over this virtual microphone to Roger right now. Thank you, Roger.
Thanks so much, Esther, and thank you so much for the invitation. And I trust that the next 45 minutes out together is going to be valuable. And really, what we want to do is unpack some ideas on how to rescue your business during the pandemic. As Esther has said, I'm a senior partner with a group called SIRDAR. We are very active in the board space, speaking to organizational leaders and directors. And we have found that this time has been one where there's obviously massive challenge. And so we've chosen this metaphor for a lot of what we're doing now called navigating the blizzard. We believe very strongly that there is a through at this time. In other words, this isn't a permanent state of affairs. Things will change without doubt. And things will be changed without doubt. But like a blizzard and a snowstorm, a blizzard also means being completely overwhelmed by things. So a blizzard of circumstance, and I think a lot of people are feeling that. So thank you for taking the time, and I trust that it'll be a time together to, in a sense, press pause and think through what are some steps to take. And the idea is to unpack. So this phrase business rescue is one that has started to emerge more and more in international business legislation. Business rescue as a concept is one that is, as I said, starting to be put into pieces of legislation to try to ensure that businesses continue. Most legal frameworks simply start with insolvency or liquidation of businesses, and so business rescue is kind of this before the end. It's how do we intervene in businesses before they get to the point where they have to be liquidated or declared insolvent. And this is the kind of the crisis we're going through is one where some of those eventualities are unfortunately on the horizon for some of us. So what I've done is I want to unpack a little bit about what business rescue looks like in a formal sense of the word, and then draw some of the key best practices and actions you can take, because business rescue has been designed in legislation. It comes a lot from the US environment. It's been used quite a lot in the European environment. I sit in South Africa, and we've had it recently introduced into our business environment here. And so it's a really valuable way to look, and it's an underlying philosophy that says before killing a business, let's try to rescue it. And it creates some space to do that, to really look and say, what are the practical things we can look at that we can face and do during this pandemic? It's understanding the right triggers. So what business rescue does is it helps us to identify a few key triggers and time frames to look at in our businesses so that we can know what to do. It also encourages engagement with stakeholders, because one of the challenges with business is in a time like this, we are not only physically isolated. So where I am in South Africa, we've been under lockdown for the last 3 weeks, and we are looking at least another 2 weeks ahead. And I've been in lockdown for probably a month, given some of the business decisions we made a bit early to shift things online. And so we can feel very isolated, and yet our businesses exist in a network of relationships, and we need to start thinking about, and if we haven't already, start engaging actively with our stakeholders to rescue the business. Also, what are the strategic elements in the business, and what are some key levers and indicators in the business to think about? The way we position this as well is we really want to help you identify the next steps to take. And so this is a practical, what I call a working webinar. So it's helpful if you have a piece of paper and a pen, and I know that some people take photos of the screen. You're welcome to do that. But really it's a working webinar. It's not a legal unpacking of what business rescue is, although we're going to touch on that in the beginning. And then thinking through the implications and impact of these steps in your business, because one of the critical things we need to be aware of is that even though there's a through, as I said, we're going through a blizzard, through a crisis, we need to start anticipating what things will look like on the other side. And so the decisions we make now, some of the ways we treat our stakeholders or are treated by our stakeholders, will also lay a foundation for what lies in the future. And then really to take decisions. Ultimately, and when I work a lot with directors and leaders in business, I say the primary factor in any business, so the thing that determines any business, is the fact that business is at its most basic level the making and implementing of decisions. And so we need to make decisions better and implement decisions better, and that's what we're wanting to help you do, so that we can all position ourselves to see this thing through. As we go, please feel free to use the Q&A box and the chat box. I keep both of those on my screen so that I can monitor, and as we go I will pick up on those. So I'm happy to try to, as far as possible, address questions as they come up, but then we will also aim to have a few minutes towards the end, and I'll give you an indication when we're coming towards the end to put those up. So please use those, and I will try my best to address, include as we go in the material, and address specific questions as they come up. There's always the issue maybe that there may be a question we have to defer and try to make, if it's very specific, try to make contact somehow afterwards, which we're happy to do in whatever way possible. Fortunately for technology, we can engage. So if we get on and think about what's unfolding, I love a couple of these quotes. Crises and deadlocks, when they occur, have at least the advantage that they force us to think. And I think that's one of the things that business rescue does, and you'll see when we look at the definitions of it, is it forces us to think about our businesses in a different way. And I think we're all doing that right now, going through this crisis, is we're all having to think of our businesses in a different way. But what we need to make sure is that we are learning from what we're thinking. Starting with, what is business rescue? And I know this is a fairly lengthy quote, but I'm going to pull out a few things from this. So business rescue is aimed to facilitate the rehabilitation of a company that is financially distressed. So we'll look at what that means in a couple of slides' time. But there is this trigger for business rescue that if we see it early enough, there's a chance, an opportunity to rehabilitate the company going forward. It allows for what is called the temporary supervision of a company and management of its affairs. And I'll unpack what that looks like. But that says that sometimes in business, we're not the best people to have the answers. So getting advice and asking questions from other people who are in the know is absolutely essential at this time. You know, this is not a time to think we know everything, because no one's been through this. But some people have got experience that we can make use of and benefit from as well. It also allows for the temporary moratorium or a stay on the rights of claimants against the company or in respect of property in its possession. So one of the key things that in the legal frameworks business rescue allows for is, in a sense, a pause on critical contracts. There are some criteria around that, but one of the things I think we need to be thinking is, how do we create some space in our business? And I think we do that, as we'll unpack a bit later, by engaging well with our stakeholders, because that space is important. And then obviously the development, last year, implementation of a business rescue plan to rescue the company by restructuring it. So restructuring the business, restructuring the property, restructuring debt, affairs, other liabilities and equity. So what it does is it wants to take a step back. So essentially, if we look at the key elements of it, there are four key elements. There's an intent to rescue or rehabilitate financially distressed companies. Now, companies are financially distressed for either internal or external reasons. And I think one of the challenges in the crisis at the moment is that some of the distress has possibly been inherent in the business for a while. I know that some of the conversations I've been having with people, they've been saying, some people in the environment are using this as an opportunity to try to get out of things, because they have been in distress for a while, and this has just triggered some internal, it's triggered that, it's brought to the surface what has already been in place. So it does create an opportunity to relook at our businesses. But the intent is to rescue the business, because it's better for a business to continue than it is for a business to die. And I think that's one of the key things to remember going through this crisis. It's better for everybody if your business gets through this. And so it's worth unpacking it and looking deeper. It does allow for, secondly, expert intervention in the company. What that means in technical terms is we have in South Africa and in America, where the law allows what are called business rescue practitioners. These in other spaces would be called turnaround specialists. So these are people who are good at looking at a business with a view to, how do we turn this thing around? It's going in the wrong direction. We need to turn it around and get it in a different direction. And this says to me that there are times, and this is a time where if we don't have the expertise sitting around our boardroom table, we need to find it. And either that's through a formal intervention, or it's finding the right people to help us think through the challenges. There's this temporary moratorium or stay on the rights of claimants. And so what the intention there is, as I said, is Business Rescue wants to create a space or pause to act. And I think one of the things, the danger of a crisis is that it can overwhelm us. And yet, even in a blizzard, so in a snowstorm, one of the first things that people who are stuck, so people who are hiking and they're caught in a snowstorm, and these things happen, very, very quickly, the first thing you do is what's called hunker down. You basically create a space of safety. You don't always just try to plow forward. You stop because you need to think. And you create a space of safety to think within. And it's in that space that we need to think about developing and implementing a business rescue plan that looks at all aspects of the business. And so part of the role often of what I call governors in the business is to step back from the business and look at the whole. Because there may be some areas of your business that don't survive going through this, but what are the areas that can survive and will survive as we go forward? And so I want to unpack some of the key learnings from that process as well. Another quote that I think is powerful is, never let a serious crisis go to waste. And this is a time where we are in a very, 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 very serious crisis. And he said here, what I mean by that is the opportunity to do things you think that you could not do before. And so let this be a time in thinking about our businesses to really try to get a different perspective. I know that sometimes I simply encourage people to go to a different place to think about their business. And I think business rescue and the idea of rescuing your business maybe goes, and I know some of us are locked up at home, but try to create a different perspective by being in a different place. Have a different conversation. Put yourselves in the shoes of someone else in the business going forward. So what I want to do is, with that in mind, and a couple of questions have come up as well. So the one has been the cost. So in most legislative frameworks, there is a schedule of costs, and business rescue practitioners are normally qualified and certified, and they would charge fees. But obviously, that's a critical thing to manage. This thing is part of running and rescuing a business. There is going to be a cost, but there is flexibility. And obviously, a lot of you are in situations where you don't have a legal framework, but you do need to be thinking of the fact that there are going to be inputs into this, and obviously those can be structured in certain ways, or explored in certain ways. Maybe that's something we can pick up on a bit later. So what does this term financial distress mean? Because I want to pick up some of the technicalities and help us to look at our business in a different way. So these are the triggers for action. So a company technically is financially distressed when the following two things exist. It appears reasonably unlikely that a company will be able to pay all its debts as they become due within the next 6 months. So the first thing business rescue forces us to think about is that we need to look further into the future. And I know this is 6 months, but actually when we're thinking about our businesses, we need to be thinking probably 12 to 18 months into the future. And I know some of us, our businesses, the nature of them is they tend to be, very short term, but the challenge is that as we grow businesses, so smaller businesses could often operate on quite a high rolling turnover, but the bigger a business gets, the more it gets established, the further out in time we need to look. So if within the next 6 months, you don't think you're going to be able to pay your bills as they become due, which is what a lot of companies are facing right now, there's probably distress. And then the second part is it's reasonably likely that the company will also become insolvent within the next 6 months. And so there are these two issues that we need to think about. There's the liquidity in our business, the cash flow, and there's the solvency. And obviously, some businesses are structured so that they may run out of cash flow, but they're solvent because they do have assets that can be used to either secure or create cash flow into the future. And so in your business, it's thinking about what are the key indicators to look at. And this entails restructuring the business. So the idea of business rescue is we restructure the business to maximize the likelihood of the company continuing in existence on a solvent basis, because so the survival of the business is critical. And obviously the key, this is a bit of a T-junction in our businesses, because liquidation, insolvency, unfortunately does become a topic of discussion, but business rescue should be designed to achieve a better return from the company than if it was immediately liquidated. And so the inputs into the business, and so even the question about costs would need to be weighed up to say, okay, it's going to cost us some money over the next period of time to initiate and to go through a process of rescuing the business. That needs to be factored into account when we think about the net return that we're going to get from the business. And obviously the survival of a business is for everybody much, much better than it's dying and being removed, which is never a good thing. How it works in practice, a couple of slides on this, and then we'll move into some of the learnings, is that obviously this financial distress position is identified. It's either identified internally by the company itself or externally. And what that means is that in business rescue, the stakeholders of the business are actually given quite a lot of power. Under the legislative frameworks, is that if you don't pay your suppliers, you don't pay your employees, they can assume that you're distressed, and so they can go to court and activate this business rescue procedure. The problem is, problem in inverted commas, is that if a board wants to retain some level of control in the legal framework, it's better to do it internally, because that's called a voluntary business rescue, and then they get to choose the business rescue practitioner they work with. If it's an involuntary one, so it's external, other stakeholders have gone to court, then the business rescue practitioner is one appointed by the court. And obviously the big key question there is, are they skilled or competent? And what we're seeing in South Africa is some of our biggest companies, some of our state-owned enterprises are going under business rescue, and some of that is challenging the nature of the business rescue practitioners themselves. And so there's a triggering, and then how it works is that the first thing that happens is an assessment is done. Now, the challenge for a business rescue practitioner, who is by definition an outsider coming into the business, is that they often battle to get the information necessary to do a good, quick, fairly robust assessment that indicates that there's a viable chance for success. And I think the key learning here during this time is we need to look as far as possible at our reporting systems, because if our reporting systems aren't in place, we diminish our decision-making ability. The reality in business is decisions need to be made based on information, and if we don't have information, we can't assess. And so one of the things to look at is to really examine your information systems in your business. A plan is then formulated, and the key thing about this plan is it does include all stakeholders. So especially employees who are directly impacted by the health or lack of health illness of a business, all right, and creditors, because effectively until you've paid for something, it's not necessarily your own. They're given a chance to vote on the formulation, to help formulate the plan, and then to vote on the plan. And this is where often stakeholders get an opportunity to do some negotiations among themselves. And as time goes on, and this is the critical challenge, as time goes on, the power of those stakeholders increase. Because if you can't pay your employees, how it works technically is that under business rescue, the right of employees increases in relation to the amount of money they are owed in back pay. And so you can see every month that you don't pay your employees, it gives them more say in the plan. Yet their interest would be in primarily in the rescuing of the business to keep it going forward. And then once it's voted on, that plan is put into play and has to be activated going forward. And so that's how business rescue works technically. But let's think about what can we do early so that we can make a difference, and what can we learn from this? And this is it's a joke graph that I picked up. Time spent looking at exponential graphs, and we've all spent all our time looking at graphs in the last few months. But what we've learned from that, and what we're learning from all of these terms, flattening the curve and epidemiological models, exponential growth, etc., is that we can do something today that'll change what happens tomorrow. And we're seeing that debate emerge. And I wanted to throw that out there because one of the key things about business rescue is it says, let's look at the right things early enough in the process so that what we do today can change the future tomorrow, and the future health of the business. And so what can we learn? What are the specific actions we can take? And I've tried to cluster some of the thinking into three key phases that we can go through in our business in thinking through navigating and managing through the crisis. And the first phase is one I call assess. This is where we need to be identifying the triggers, and then we need to be asking the question, when we've identified the triggers, what must we look at? What are the things we must look at in our business? And this process would typically take everybody at leadership level in the business. It would absorb all of them. We need to be drawing as far as possible on our board, our CEO, our CFO, the key people with the information. The second phase, and what I'll do is I'll put them all out, and then I'll come back and I'll unpack in a little bit more detail. We then need to go into, after we've assessed, we need to go into what I call an architecture phase, or an architect phase. And this is where we need to be pausing as far as possible, thinking as deeply as possible, reflecting on the assessment and what we can do about it. And then we need to go into design mode. And so you'll see at the bottom there, I've said we need to take what I call a design team approach, which means we need to include everybody in the business who can help us design a way through this. And that doesn't necessarily mean the board has to be involved in everything. This is where actually the best phrase to use is, whoever can add value to this process is worth including in this team. And it could be anybody in your business. But it should also include key stakeholders, because your stakeholder relationships are going to be critical to the way forward. In the blue block there, you'll see the engage and engineer. And I'll unpack a little bit about why we need to think about our relationships, or our relations in the business, and also our systems in the business. And I'll unpack that in a couple of slides' time. And then the last thing, or the third phase, so assess, architect, and activate. This is where movement, direction, and momentum start to come in, where we've actually got to translate what we've thought about into action as quickly as possible. And so creating an accountability structure is absolutely essential in this, so that we can ensure that the action actually happens. And then one of the things we've got to do is we've got to properly report or disclose on our progress, which will cultivate trust with our stakeholders as well. And this is where the whole team gets involved, where the whole organization. This is the combination of governing the business from the board level, and then managing the business and working together to move things forward. So if we drop a level and say, well, what does this mean, and what are some details in each of these areas? So assess, this is where we aim to discover and understand. It's about triggers, and it's about evaluation. Here's some thoughts on each of these. So in our businesses, the most important indicators to think about are what are called leading indicators. See, often what happens is our reporting systems are focused on not leading but lagging indicators. And so this is really a critical element that we need to think about. And what a leading indicator does is, a leading indicator tells you what's going to happen, not just what happened. And so the challenge is, most of our businesses, we report retrospectively. Here we need to find the indicator that tells us about the future, not about the past. And where do we start thinking about that? The first place to think about is our business flows. So how does our business flow? What goes first, second, third? So what are the dependencies in our business? And we want to identify the earliest possible measure, the earliest possible indicator. And we need to put systems in place that help us monitor that. Because if we can't monitor the earliest possible measure, which is the start of the process, but we're only measuring the outcome, then we're always going to be chasing our tail in a sense. And so here, inputs are better than outputs or outcomes. Both are important, and we're aiming for an outcome, but the leading indicator often looks at the input. For instance, the access to raw materials is going to be critical in this place, and so in this crisis, and so that is going to be a critical indicator. And you would know from how your business flows what flow, where's that bubble going to go through your system. If you have a delay in your initial inputs into the business, how much of a bubble is it going to create in your business? Which is helpful, because then that'll help you determine how long you need to cover things, how you need to restructure things, which contracts you need to relook at. It also helps you identify, is there enough time to look for alternatives? In your sales process, what does that look like from the flow of a sales process? And then remember those inputs, even in the customer engagement part of your business, which is typically on the flip side, on the external side, the outflow side. What are some of the process flows there? Because ordering, all of those your procurement processes, what do those look like in terms of flows? And to look for the earliest indicator there. And here it's also important to recognize that these things are not always quantitative. In other words, we can't always put a number to it. So we like to find numbers in business because they're the things that are the most stable and solid, and we can measure them. But the challenge is, a lot of what's happening at the moment is what people are saying, the stories they're telling. And what I mean by it's the narrative, it's the account of what happened. All right, it's not just the facts of the business, but it's how we feel about them. And so as we look at the world unfolding in different ways, and being in primarily, I think most of us are sitting in Africa, we're lagging the rest of the world in terms of the development of this virus, which is a good thing, because it's giving us an opportunity to prepare and learn, but it's also giving us an opportunity to start listening to the stories. Start listening to the stories of both the managing of the pandemic, but also the managing of business. So we need to look for those stories and say, what have other people in other parts of the world with businesses similar to mine done? And fortunately, with social media, we can get access to lots of information. And so we should be spending our time looking in our own businesses, but also looking externally what we can learn as well. It's also thinking of our business, not just in terms of the things and the activities, but also the relationships. So critical to the success of a business is that businesses succeed because they have all three of those things in place, and they manage them well. That businesses have assets, and we can have measures and indicators on our assets and how they're being utilized. There are measures and indicators on our activities, but we also need to think about the relationships of the business, both internal and external. And you'll see that feeds into what I'm going to say in a few minutes about stakeholder engagement. So that's assessing and identifying. The second part, and this is a powerful model that is useful for both planning into the future and evaluating the present. It's called the business model canvas, and Google it, because you can get this online, or you can take a photo of the screen. But essentially, it says, and it helps us focus. So we use this as a tool often to say, where are the key focus areas? So from our indicators at the beginning, what is that indicating? Is it indicating an issue on the customer side of the business? So the relationships, the people who's buying from us, the channels we're using, because big challenge for businesses that are still very much bricks and mortar businesses is this channel is being challenged because people can't get out of the houses. And that's been constrained and could be for a long time. We're not sure. Or are there things on the back end of the business? So are there key activities that are being challenged? So people having to work from home, internet connectivity, do we have the assets, the resources to facilitate that? What are those kind of indicators in the business? And so it helps us focus on the key areas of the business. And one of the things we need to also be looking at in the crisis is saying, we can't do everything at once. We need to focus on the key areas in the business so that we can do something about them and then move on to the next ones. And so part of the process is the challenge is that in a crisis, our time horizon tends to shorten. I know because I've been involved with a few companies in strategic facilitation and planning. And in the last 6 months, we've been looking at the 2025 or the 2030 plan. And yet we've got to recognize that may still remain, but our focus suddenly turns into from the 5 years or the 10 years into the 12 months or the 6 months or even the 3 months. So what is important is that we need to recognize that our horizons tend to shorten and our focus tends to move to the short term, but we still need to keep our eye on the final destination as far as possible, because our short-term destination should still be leading us towards our long-term destination. We don't want to change everything. We need to control what we can control and leave what we can't control, alone in a sense. But we must also learn to think multi-horizon. So if this is where we are now and we've got our long-term vision, we need to be saying, well, what does that look like in the medium and the short term? And this could be maybe your 5-year plan. So think back to the next 2 years and say, well, okay, 2022, coming out of that, where should we be? And then in the next 6 to 12 months, because this year is going to be a critical one to navigate through. And then look and say, how do we redesign the business with those horizons in mind? And here critical is that there's no stone unturned in our assessment. There's no sacred cows, and I put that in inverted commas. But I mean, that's critical to recognize that going through the evaluation process, if we don't do it properly, then we don't end up with a good opportunity to design something going forward. Next phase, and it comes up, there's a question, thank you, about stakeholders. And so after the assessment, one of the key things we need to think about is architecting. And this is where we think about the stakeholders, and especially a key party who's involved in the business as shareholders. I know 2 days ago I was facilitating a session, and one of the gentlemen on a board, and he's an independent director, he said we had to have a discussion with the shareholders about pausing and not paying that dividend that they were expecting this year, because it has to include those kind of big decisions, and that's best if everybody is sitting to some extent around the table. So in the architecting process, this design team approach, it's where we need to work on 2 elements of the business. We need to work on the relations in the business and the systems in the business. In the relations, we're trying to secure the support, and it's in the support of the relations where we do the renegotiations and some of that restructure, but also our own systems. Do our policies work? Do our processes work? Because ultimately, performance in a business, so if we think about how a business is put together, and we think about where performance comes from. So I often use this tool, what I call a performance continuum, and it comes from essentially the combination of systems and the combination of people. And more mature companies have more systems in place. Obviously, we can't completely systematize, but often what happens is if we don't have sufficient systems in place, all right, and we're going through a crisis now where our systems are going to be tested, and if we rely too much on people, then our people get overwhelmed. And so we need to use this crisis to say, how do we relook at both our people elements in the business, which is our stakeholders, as well as the systems, and stakeholders internal and external. Remember, when I say stakeholders, I'm not just meaning outsiders, I mean our employees. How do we engage with them? Our shareholders. It's important to think about how do we put together and get the different perspectives around the table. And some thoughts here in terms of bringing the stakeholders into the decision-making process. One obviously has to identify the stakeholders that are critical. And important here, especially in a crisis, is I call rules of the game and stakeholder engagement, is you cannot engage with stakeholders at a category level. It's not all your suppliers that you need to talk to. You need to be thinking of the critical suppliers where the relationship is strong and you can do something with that relationship. Your customers the same, your employees the same. Every single smaller category or individual relationship is important, and we engage with stakeholders on a relationship level. And the relationship level is two-way. And those 2 ways are the inside out, which I call impact, okay? Our impact on them, and outside in, which is their influence on us. And that's essentially how we need to think about our stakeholders, is that every single stakeholder, every single relationship, we have an impact on them, they have an influence on us. And we need to be identifying in this time the critical stakeholders that are necessary to our long-term success. So part of our strategic thinking on the horizons is to say, we go from our 5-year to our 2-year, is to say, well, which stakeholders do we need in 2 years' time in order to move us forward? Because those are the ones in the next 3 to 6 months that we need to be thinking about and working with, because they're the ones who are going to help us go forward. Which contracts do we need to think about restructuring if we possibly can? And so when we're thinking about stakeholders and the engagement with stakeholders, we need to be also asking the question as well, what is the key context of the business? So you've got to think of individual stakeholders, not the categories of stakeholders, but individual stakeholders. You've got to think the 2 dimensions, impact and influence, all right? And then you've got to ask yourself the question, what is the context? And the context of stakeholder engagement is our strategy. So the key definition there of stakeholders that highlights some of these elements is that a stakeholder is any party that is impacted by the organization. So we've really got to think, who do we impact as it pursues a strategic objective? So that objective that may have changed from, as I said, a 5-year to a 2-year to a 6-month, we need to think, who are the critical stakeholders that will help us get through this, because we impact them and they're able to influence our achievement of our strategic objective. And then if we've done that, we can then ask ourselves the question, well, what are we wanting to ultimately build with our stakeholders? And here a concept called social license is quite valuable, because it asks the question, what are we trying to build with different stakeholders? Are we just trying to have legitimacy with them? All right, which is where we have the difference between them withdrawing from us or them accepting that we exist. And so sometimes we just need to retain legitimacy with certain of our stakeholders. These are stakeholders that just their acceptance. We don't necessarily need to work together with them, but we need them in a sense to, in inverted commas, leave us alone. Accept that we're part of the environment. Second level of social, or second boundary is called credibility. Which stakeholders during this time do we need to build credibility with? Because what credibility gives us is approval. So are we engaging with the right stakeholders whose approval we need to get through this crisis? So which of our employees need to approve of what we're doing? How do we communicate with them? The last thing you need in a crisis is a whole lot of people to jump ship, in inverted commas, as well. The last thing you need is for a whole lot of your suppliers to just shut the door on you. You need to be saying, whose approval do you need at this time? Because that costs more than legitimacy. And then at the end of the day, or the third level, is trust. And trust is where it gives you identification. So which stakeholders do you need standing alongside you in this time, in this crisis? Because it's a trusted relationship where you would have identification and, as I said, be able to stand alongside. And so thinking about your stakeholders in that sense is determining what level we need from different stakeholders, because the cost and the investment at this time increases based on whether we need these to be trusted, because are these trusted relationships that we need to leverage off and rely on in this time? Are these stakeholders that we just, in a sense, need credibility with? We need their approval of what we're doing, so we need to keep them informed the whole time. And so being proactive about engaging with stakeholders is important. Or are these stakeholders that we, in a sense, need to manage them, just in a sense to pause the relationship and have legitimacy? They accept that we're all going through a crisis together, but we don't have to engage with them actively and spend much time and investment on them. And thinking about your stakeholders in that way enables you to also determine which of the voices, because we need to listen to all of the voices that are necessary. And finding the voice that we haven't heard is an important one at this time. And maybe some of your employees are sitting with incredible ideas of how to get through this crisis, redesigning the business, what opportunities to take advantage of in the business, maybe engaging with a supplier can lead to a joint venture in the short term that generates the cash flow to get through the business, or a customer who's trying to do something for their own customer base, and you can help facilitate that. So listening and getting the right voices is absolutely critical around the boardroom table at the moment. And a critical part of that is engaging, as we've said, with shareholders. Because if we don't engage with our shareholders at this time, it's going to be difficult. And so rethinking our involvement, our relationship with stakeholders is absolutely critical. And so if we go back to the architecting or business concept there, that's thinking primarily about the most important thing, thinking about our relationships in the business, and thinking, well, how do we engage and make sure that we secure our performance of the business with the people in the business, which is most important. The second one is to look at, is to say, how do we think about our businesses from a systems point of view? And a model I often use to do this is looks at the different elements of what I call governance architecture. And so we need to, and again, using a model like the business model canvas, identify the different parts of the business. What are the different parts of the business that we need to be aware of at this time? What I mean by that is, this is the boundaries. What are the different parts, elements of the business? As I said, using the business model canvas, is this a relationship issue? Is it an activities issue? Is it a people issue? What does our organogram look like in the crisis? And it may be necessary to redraft some of those, even if it's in draft form, so that it's designed to get through the crisis. Some of the policies we put in place may only be for the next 6 months. That's absolutely fine. It's looking at how do we structure the business and the parts of the business so that we get through it. Once we do that, we need to look at the different relationships in the business. And a relationship in business essentially helps us think about the flows of what I call accountability. So accountability always moves up in a business. And so our policy framework would always hold ultimately the board accountable, because that's what the law does. But the board needs to give away 2 aspects in a policy framework. And those are the responsibility to do the work and the authority to do the work. And so in this time as well, we need to rethink our responsibility. Who's going to do what, and are they authorized to do it? We may need to relook at some of our delegations of authority to ensure that the relationships between the parts of the business, especially the parts that are under strain, are absolutely under control. And that may feel like a bit of giving away of authority, but I've heard the word a lot in the last month or so, that we need to trust our people. They're working from home. We need to trust them. We need to give them the tools they need, give them the authority they need, and trust them to do the work that they're employed to do. Obviously, we do that with reporting and disclosure in mind. So coming back, the other flow is that we need to get information from people about what and how they are exercising the responsibility and authority. Because if we've given people responsibility and authority, we can hold them accountable through expecting them and allowing them to disclose that. What we can then do is so that's how we link the people and the parts that results in the performance. And so it's thinking about how do we do that. We can then run our processes. So our business processes, I know I've said board processes, but business processes, any processes in the business which would then run. And if we rethink our businesses, it enables us to take a step back and go back and say, because what we're doing at the moment is we're reviewing how our businesses work, using tools like the business model canvas. You may have other tools that you've used. We were reassessing, do the parts still work as intended? Is there a way to change how the business is structured in terms of parts and relationships? Because we are going to be running different processes in our business. And so that speaks to the architect side of the business, pausing, thinking, reflecting, and designing. And I know that it's difficult to often find the time, but what we found in South Africa, so we're 3 weeks into the crisis. Part of what people are finding is they're still really, really busy. But as we get used to structuring our own lives, because some people are busy simply because they're now juggling family and business in one place, because most people who can continue to work are working from home. But the structures of our own lives are enabling us to structure our businesses. And so we're creating the time to architect our businesses because we've spent a bit of time assessing and architecting our own lives. And I think in a crisis, we've got to take that into account. Critical part of the architect process is to get key stakeholders involved. Make sure that they know what you're doing, because it's the relationships which will get you through the business. Third phase, and this is where we're starting to wind down, we're thinking about activating. And so critical part there is to ensure that there is some movement, the danger at the moment. So even when a team of hikers or mountain climbers gets into a blizzard and they hunker down and they think through the options, all right, and they assess the blizzard, they assess what they need to do. But if the blizzard is going to be long-term, they need to start moving. And they move in a different way, obviously, which is where the architecture comes, and they've redesigned how they structure how they carry their kit or that kind of thing. But it's important to start the action in the business going, because what action does is it creates movement, and movement enables us to get direction, and direction enables us to build up momentum. And this is where the whole team is involved. And what I mean by some of those things and some of the principles underlying that is that movement is more important than direction. You know, the picture I have is that if you can get into your car and wrestle with the steering wheel as much as you like, but you'll never turn the car around unless the car is turning. And so business rescue recognizes that businesses are moving in the wrong direction. We're in the middle of the crisis, and we may have realized and recognized that we're not going to get through this if we continue going in the same direction. So we need to change direction, but we need to start moving first. And I think the danger is we've shut things down. And I think this is the big debate economically, internationally, is we've got to get this thing going again. It will look different, but we need to start the momentum and the movement going, because direction can be changed. But you can't change direction or test the direction until there's movement. And so a large part of coming out of an assessment and an architecture process is to test everything you do. So going back to the indicators, asking the question, how do you know that your assumptions you've made are true, and that you can test those as you move forward? And then very important is to keep in mind the ultimate destination. So that multiple horizon thinking that is enabling us to despite we're going through a crisis where we can't see further than a few months ahead, we do need to keep our final destination in mind, because ultimately there are a number of paths to the same destination. And if we've been clear about our strategic thinking, and we've thought through different scenarios, we'll be able to develop some different pathways. And part of this process is developing the pathway. So that's the critical part of the business rescue plan, which is formulated and voted upon with all stakeholders in mind. And that's why I say the design team has to be as comprehensive as possible, because it's those voices that you haven't normally heard that could have the answer, the solution for the business. I know that there have been a range of different options of engaging with employees. I've heard of obviously the standard, the worst case scenario, we get rid of people. The second kind of challenging thing is we cut everybody's income. Thirdly, it's saying, well, let's cut income, but on a sliding scale, depending on what people need. Third, we've seen people say, well, how do we defer some of the payment? So we can't pay now, but can we pay later? And an innovative scheme that I heard of a couple of days ago was the company said, well, if we can't pay our employees, the amount that we can't pay them and can't pay them into the future will accrue at a certain point in time into an employee share scheme, because their involvement and investment in this time could be valuable for them in the long term, and it will get them to buy into the business. And so people are exploring lots and lots of different ways, but it's getting the movement going and then testing that as we go forward. We do need to keep in mind the final destination. And so to close, thinking about and reflecting on, and this is where if you've got questions, comments, remember we said business rescue is an emerging practice, not just in turnaround, but also in legal frameworks. And the design or the idea of business rescue is to keep businesses alive, as opposed to you get them to the point where they just liquidate. Because unfortunately, if we just have liquidation or insolvency, we tend to push things too far, and then it's the only option. So this is creating a gap in time. It's a 6-month horizon that we need to keep monitoring, at least. I prefer a 12 or 18-month horizon. But part of that is assessing and learning in our businesses to assess what are we looking for, what are the leading triggers, and evaluating where those areas of the business of challenge are. Are they financial, which is obviously a good indicator and often the one we measure the most, but are there systems indicators we need to look for? The earliest leading indicator is important. Are they people indicators? And we look at that through our business model. Once we've done that and assessed it, normally with the board and senior leadership team would be monitoring that, because they're the ones who authorized to make the decision about, well, let's do a rethink. Let's re-architect our businesses. And in this time, we need to pause as far as is possible. We need to think deeply. We need to reflect not just on what was and not what is and what we're going through, but also reflect on where we want to be in the future and maintain that horizon in mind. And then that leads into our engagement with stakeholders and the engineering of the systems. And I've chosen those two words because they're two different ways of dealing with things. Our engagement is to secure the support. It's to cultivate the trust. It's to identify the strong relationships, what we need out of those relationships, which ones can we lean on. It's also then to look at our policies and processes and systems, the operations of the business model, as we've mentioned a couple of times. And that would include all stakeholders and the design team approach, which is critical. And then moving into the activate, we've got to create accountability and start the ball rolling. We've got to start movement in whatever form we can. And that means we need to hold people accountable. We need to trust people, but we need to also enable them to disclose and require them to disclose how they've exercised that responsibility going forward. Any thoughts, questions, comments? And I have got a couple coming up, which is great. I believe relationships play a big role. Thanks, Marita, I think it is, in rescuing a business. What would be the action when the key person and owner of the business is not aligned with other stakeholders in terms of the priorities? Oof, that's a tough question, but I think it's an important one to pause and ask the question, why are they not aligned? So are they not aligned because they don't recognize the severity of the situation? Are they not aligned because their values are misaligned? Are they not aligned because there is a power differential between the different parties? And so unpacking that, and I think there's an opportunity for some deeper conversations. It may be necessary in a situation like that, and again, without knowing more details, to think about how or when one could possibly get an independent party involved. So the advantage of business rescue to some degree is it brings an independent person into the equation. Somebody who doesn't have any prior relationships or knowledge of the situation. And obviously there's some dangers of that, but the benefit is they can ask the questions that no one's asked before. They can see things that nobody's seen before. And so what I would suggest in that situation is either try to have the conversation and try to find why the alignment isn't happening, or secondly, to try to think about do you need to get someone else involved in the situation to mediate or open up that conversation. Mercy writes, how practical is the process for SBGs? Could you clarify for me? Just at the moment, I'm at a loss of what SBGs are, so please put that into the group as well. But I think one of the challenges is many of us are running smaller growing businesses, and so we're going to have to make tough decisions. And especially that's why I said no sacred cows, no stones unturned in thinking about who we engage with, how we engage with them. We may need to be making decisions about which parts of the business actually get through this and which parts of the business aren't able to survive. We may need to restructure the business. But I wanted to end with this quote because I think it's powerful. So Mercy, if you can just put SBGs, and I'll try to address that. But deep within every crisis is an opportunity for something beautiful. And I think the wonderful thing is that it gives us an opportunity. SGBs, school governing bodies. Are you thinking about that? I presume that's what my acronym SGBs is. I do think from a school, schools are an interesting one, and you've triggered a whole series of and possibly small and growing businesses. Okay, thank you for that. Very, very practical, Mercy. I think going back to this process. So this process, this thinking around this is not. I haven't thought of any specific business in mind. I've just thought of what are the steps one needs to take, learning from what's implemented or established in business rescue, there's this assessment phase. We've got to figure out whether this thing is rescuable first. And we've got to trigger that thinking. We've then got to design the way forward. And this isn't rocket science. It's thinking, how do we take a step and redesign the business from the ground up? And then we've got to have action. And we've got to hold people accountable for that action, because the danger at the moment is we can just press pause and never get going again. So small and growing businesses may have some really difficult decisions to make about their people, about what business they're in, about what part of the business they can continue, about maybe exploring opportunities, because the advantage of smaller businesses is we're often more agile than other businesses, and so we can make turns and changes. We can use the opportunities in the crisis to rethink what we're doing. Trust that's valuable. Thank you for your time. And one of the things we're doing is we are, together with the EAVCA, going to be doing a half day. We're going to be calling it Navigating COVID-19. And it's going to be taking some of these concepts, because these concepts are critical, and looking a bit deeper at things like what decision making. We'll dig a bit deeper in terms of stakeholders. We'll also think about risk and risk management and risk governance, and thinking about that, but practically. We'll also be providing in that workshop some cases, examples, tools, and templates. So you'll walk away from there with some actual things to work with, and get your hands dirty with, in a sense of wrestling through the crisis. Yeah, Mercy, I think what we need to do is, you've got some interesting questions coming up. I mean, it'll be great to engage with you outside of this, maybe through Esther. But thank you, Esther. I trust that's been valuable. And back to you.
Great. No, thank you very much, Roger. And thank you for taking the time to join this conversation and connect with us. And, just to share your expertise in the space. And certainly I'll be sending information with regards to the half-day workshop that we're planning to hold with SIRDAR in the coming weeks. And thank you to everybody who's been able to join us in this discussion today. As before, we'll be able to share an offline recording of this session for those who are not able to join us for the live discussion today. And EAVCA will continue to provide access to a range of experts on relevant themes and topics that will help us sort of like navigate this period and the outcome of sort of like coronavirus and its impact in businesses. But to everybody, thank you so much, and have a good Friday afternoon.
And stay safe and sanitized. Exactly. All the best. Thanks for the opportunity. Cheers.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.